Namaste. I, Dr. Saurya Brahmbhatt, Assistant Professor, Department of English, the Maharaja Sayajirao University of Baroda. I thank UGC HRDC Gujarat University for giving me this opportunity to connect with you and deliver my session on translation studies. I personally thank from my bottom of heart to Professor Jagdish Joshi, Professor and Director of UGC Human Resource Development Center of Gujarat University. He is a visionary man that he provides online courses, refresher courses on various platforms like Moodles and Swayam Arpit for the teachers and learners of the nation. His initiatives are widely recognized and appreciated by teaching fraternity and UGC. I also thank his entire team who work so hard to provide such e-content to you on such beautiful short-term training program of translation studies. Dear friends, today we are going to discuss various points on translation studies, development of translation. We are also going to focus on the process of translation, the history of translation. The various definitions of translation, decoding and recoding of translation, and most importantly, the purpose of translation. So in this session, we are going to discuss these points, and I am sure that after this lecture, you will be able to understand the purpose and the aim of translation studies. Friends, before we go into the discussion of translation studies, I want to put two beautiful words before you. As a teacher, when I teach literature, when I teach poetry, I transmit the experience of a poet to the students. So ultimately, I am transmitting the anubhuti of the writer, of the poet. There are two words in Hindi. One, anubhuti, and second, Anubhav. I think after the end of this session, we will be able to understand the basic difference between Anubhav and Anubhuti. When we read any literature, when we read poetry, when we read drama, when we read novel or a short story, we experience something. हमें उसका कुछ अनुभव होता है. उस भाषा के द्वारा, उस कहानी के जो पात्र है, वो पात्रों के द्वारा बोली गई जो बातें हैं, वो हमें उस कहानी के समय, स्थान के बारे में एक अनुभव देता है. कभी कभी हम उसे अनुभूति भी कहते हैं. मगर कई बार एक साहित्य के शिक्षक के तौर पर जब हम विद्यार्थियों को कोई कहानी या कविता पढ़ाते हैं, we face some problems. When I was a student of literature, there was a poem which we studied of William Wordsworth, Daffodils. I grew up in a very small town where I didn't have any access to the world. I hardly know the meaning of the word daffodils. So a small curious mind asked to the teacher that what is daffodils? And my teacher translated one kind of flower. Is that so? When we are teaching literature to the students, we are transmitting the expressions. We are giving the anubhutis of the poet to the students. But my friends, we really need to understand one thing before we transmit that anubhuti to the students. Something go in our mind, and that is the experiment. We do anubhav. We pass through from the process of anubhav to give the proper word to the non-native learners. I speak these things before you as a teacher of English. When I teach English poetry, if you are teaching the Gujarati or Hindi poetry to your students, and if their mother tongue is Hindi and Gujarati, there might possible that you will not face such problem. So sometime we need to take the help of translation to give that exact anubhuti to the students, whether it is a drama, whether it is a novel or a short story or a poem. Because if as a teacher we fail to give and express this that anubhuti which is there in that piece of literature, then we cannot fulfill the purpose of teaching. And for that, we must have the anubhav of a translation. Anubhuti can be absurd, can be arbitrary, can be abstract, but anubhav is concrete, is material, it's solid. This is the first thing we require or we take the help of translation in our academics as a teacher. But when we talk about research, after graduation or a post graduation, when students come to you and want to explore some areas, there also the student require his skill of translation. If the primary resource, the primary reading material is not available in the native language, and many a time student face problem in understanding the basic resource which they have. It is hard for them to chronologize those problems of research because there is some problem in translating the concept which is written in non-native language. We know that in post-colonial era, thanks to globalization, English is the language of the world, where the most of the research are published in English language. And to go further into investigation in those areas, we need to take the help of English language. And if we are not good in that particular language, we need to take the help of translation. There are tools available on internet to translate the websites, to translate the e-content. But how far you can rely on those online available tools? I have seen many students in my class that while reading some passage in English, and if they feel that this is difficult to understand, they copy that paragraph and paste it into Google Translator and read it in Gujarati. And when I see the Gujarati version of that digitally translated. Sometimes I feel that even you have the same experience, that that word, the entire paragraph which is there in Gujarati or Hindi has no meaning. Sometimes the proper word is not being used by those online tools. This is the 21st century, which we call the age of technology. And most of the scientists and most of the nations are working on artificial intelligence, that in next few decades that AI will take place of human resource. Even in that time, we talk about the language of the machine, we talk about the language of programming. But the most important thing is that we can, by programming, making such program that we can make the machine to understand the command. But it is very hard to train the human brain. It is a process that if I speak in French or in German, you may not understand. If you speak something to me in French or German or in Tamil or Telugu, I will not understand anything about it. What does it mean? But even such tools are available on your smartphone, that if someone speaks in foreign language, that application will translate for you the meaning in your mother tongue. But still, it has its own limitations. As far as the development of those tools, we need to enrich the database and the data system of those tools. So today, we will try to understand the nature of human brain, how it works, how it reacts, and how it functions to understand the foreign language. We will also focus on translation studies, the various ways of translating the things. Translation is perceived as an intrinsic part of the foreign language teaching process. It has really been studied for its own sake. As I told you at the beginning, that there are various aims to study translation studies. We have aim of teaching literature, we have aim to research in various fields, we have aim to teach foreign language to the students, and for that we need the study of translations. We have to rely upon the studies of translation. Translation involves the reading of a source language into the targeted language, so as to ensure that the surface meaning of the two will be approximately similar and the structures of the source language will be preserved as closely as possible, but not so closely that the targeted language structures will be seriously distorted. This is what we see in the online tools. You copy a paragraph, paste it on your online tool of translation, and that tool try to find the approximately similar word of the source language into the targeted language. But we see the change in the structure of the source language. If you compare the structure of the source language and the targeted language, you will find that the targeted language structure is different than the source language. So this is the one thing, this is the one way we translate with one go. But if suppose we involve oneself physically to translate that passage into target language, we require anubhav. Anubhav of words, anubhav of meaning, anubhav of understanding. If we have such things, then I am quite sure that the structure of target language will not be seriously distorted. If we do not have that anubhav, then we can make and give the surface meaning or approximately similar meaning to the words which are available in target language. But translation does not mean that you approximately put the similar or close words in target language. As a translator, it is very much important for us to keep the structure of the source language as it is. We should not disturb the structure of the source language when we translate it into the target language. So this is the first aim. This is the first problem is before us, that whenever we translate anything from the source language to target language, we may find the similar and approximately close words for source language to target language, but we fail to maintain the structures of source language. And that's why a new canon, new field has emerged which talks about the science of translation, in which we study as translation studies. Source language, the language being translated from, and target language means the language being translated to. These are the two words before us when we do translation. The first is source language, and the second is target language. सोर्स लैंग्वेज का मतलब है द लैंग्वेज बीइंग ट्रांसलेटेड फ्रॉम, जिसमें से हमें अनुवाद करना है. टारगेट लैंग्वेज द लैंग्वेज बीइंग ट्रांसलेटेड टू, जिसमें अनुवाद करना है, जिसका अनुवाद करना है और जिसमें अनुवाद करना है. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, गुजराती to English, from Gujarati to English. So here the Gujarati is a source language. में करना है to English. According to Holmes' paper, he refers to many key aspects of translation. It talks to translation as a process, a product, or a function. What does he say? He says that translation is a process. Second, translation is a product. Or third, translation is a function. Let us see in detail. In the 1990s, it can be seen as the establishment of a series of a new alliance that brought together research into the history, practice, and philosophy of translation with other intellectual trends. We know that in every corner of the world, history is in process. Practical research is in process. Development of new philosophies and theories are in process. So, it was needed. There was a need to make a bridge of this all research. And there was only one tool, one key to make a bridge between philosophy, history, and science and art, and that was translation. The links between translation studies and post-colonial theory, as I discussed in the beginning of this lecture, that in the post-colonial era we are talking about translation studies. Thanks to globalization, which represents one such alliance as do the links between translation studies and corpus linguistics. The another significant alliance is that between translation studies and gender studies. For language, Shimon points out, does not simply mirror reality, but intervenes in the shaping of meaning. So, translation is not just giving the similar word, but we go a step further in linguistics, in semiotics, and take it in another way that translation means intervene in the shaping of meaning. The person who does translation is known as a translator. The tool which translate for you online is known as translator. When I talk about anubhav, how we can get that anubhav? We get anubhav only when we involve oneself in some process. When you are in process of learning something, you get anubhav that this is the right way or this could be the right way to study this subject. This could be proper better way to study this subject. Similarly, translators are directly involved in that shaping process, whether the text they are dealing with is an instruction manual or a legal document or a novel or a classical drama. There are so many examples that suppose you buy a new electronic gadget, you find a small user manual with it, and that user manual is written in many languages, have the same meaning, have the same structure, but communicates in different language. And for that, we require translators. There is a translator who worked behind it. We required translators in many fields, in industry, in courts. We require translators for translating literature. Just as the gender studies challenged the nation and the notion of a single unified concept of culture by asking awkward questions about the ways in which canonical traditions are formed. So, translation studies, through its many alliances, ask questions about what happens when a text is transferred from source to target culture. We read the translation of Western writers, their novels, their drama. Even we read the translation of a text which is basically written in Gujarati, and we read its translation of Hindi. find the cultural differences, because every language has its own nature, and it is the translator who takes care about that nature and translate the text, transferred the text from source to target culture. So translator is not only translating the language which is written, but it is translates the culture. It translates the nature of two languages. And when a translator involves oneself in the process of translation, he might have different approaches to translate. According to Peter Newmark, he says that there are 8 different approaches to translation. First, a translation must give the words of the original. Second, a translation must give the ideas of the original. Third, a translation should read like an original work. A translation should read like a translation. A translation should reflect the system of the original. Sixth, a translation should process the style of the original. Seventh, a translation should read as a contemporary of the original. And last, a translation may add to or omit from the original. So these are the approaches a translation has. A translation must give the words of the original. So when you translate from source to target language, we must give the appropriate original word in target language. The idea must be conveyed originally from source to target language. A translation must be read like an original work. हमने कई बार ऐसे अच्छे अनुवाद पढ़े हैं where the translator is very good in its hand. So he translates the work in a beautiful way that even you read in a target language and you feel that it is original work written in English or written in Gujarati. Suppose there is a translation of a book which is there is a translation from English to Gujarati or in Hindi. तो अगर आप पढ़ोगे तो गुजराती और हिंदी में आपको ऐसा लगेगा जैसे गुजराती या हिंदी में ही ये लिखा गया है. तो ऐसा भी एक अप्रोच होना चाहिए. A translation should reflect the style of the original. As I told you in the beginning, this is one of the greatest challenge before the translator, to keep the style intact as it is. उसमें कोई छेड़खानी या कोई बदलाव नहीं होना चाहिए. A translation should possess the style of the original. It should not, it not only reflect, but it should also possess the style of the original. And last, a translation may add or omit from the original, and that is the also a liberty a translator has, that he can edit, add or omit from the original and give something better in the target language. Describe the process of translator from source language to target language. Jacobson goes on immediately to point to a central problem in all types, that while message may serve as adequate interpretations of code units of message, there is ordinarily no full equivalence through translation. Even apart, synonyms does not yield equivalence. Jacobson shows how intralingual translation often has to resort to a combination of codes units in order to interpret the meaning of a single unit. For example, we have two words in Hindi and Gujarati, amantran and nimantran. And in English, there is a word invitation. So when you are translating this word invitation, as a translator, you have two words in hand. One is amantran and second is nimantran. Now, which word is appropriate, which suits with the source language and its nature, its structure, its object, either amantran or nimantran? The choice is all upon the translator. By reading the source language, the text, if you feel that it is an invitation given to an individual, then it must be nimantran. While translating the word invitation, he has to use the word nimantran instead of amantran. And if the invitation is open for all, then the translator should use the word amantran instead of nimantran. Because in Hindi, in Gujarati, there is a difference between amantran and nimantran. When you invite all, that is amantran. When you invite someone individually, that is nimantran. So as a translator, we have to focus on these things. So just rely upon the dictionary meanings is not enough in proper translation. Use of synonyms may give a perfect as a synonym for ideal or vehicle as a synonym for convenience. But in neither case can that be said to be complete in its sense, because each unit contains within itself a set of non transferable associations and connotations. So that word has its own connotations, general areas of interpret. We see that we have seen that translation is a process. Translation is a product. So what we get out of the process of translating, the two are product oriented. In the emphasis is one, the functional aspect of the target language text in relation to the source language text, and two of them are process oriented, in that the emphasis is on analyzing what actually takes place during translation. How this history, how this translation or the process of translation started? It's a component, part of literary history. The type of work involved in this area includes investigation of the theories of translation at different times, the critical response to translations, the practical process of commissioning and publishing translations, the role and function of translations in a given period, the methodical development of translation, and by far the most common type of study, analysis, the work of individual translations. Translation has its own relation with culture. As we discussed earlier, that when you translate something, you are translating the nature of the language, the nature of the text. Work on the influence of a text, author or genre, on the absorption of the norms of the translated text into the target language system, the principles of selection operating within that system. It includes studies which place their emphasis on the comparative arrangement of linguistic elements between the source language and target language text with regard to phonemic, morphemic, lexical, and semiotic level. Into this category come studies of the problems of linguistic, language bound meaning, linguistic untranslatability, of machine translation, etc., and also studies of the translation problems of non-literary texts. Did sometime translation become genre specific? Suppose you are translating a poem or a story, that we call it genre specific, includes the whole area of literature, literary translation in theory and practice. Studies may be general or genre specific, including investigation of the practical problems of translating poetry, theatre texts, or liberty and the affiliated problems of translation of the cinema, whether dubbing or subdubbing. Under this category also come studies of the poetics of individual, translators and comparison between them, studies of the problem of formulating a poetics, a studies of interrelationship between source language and target language, text and author, translator and reader. Above all, in this section come studies attempting to formulate a theory of literary translation. The first step towards an examination of the process of translation must be to accept, although translation has a central core of linguistic activity, it belongs most probably to semiotics, the science that studies sign systems or structures, sign process, and sign functions. Beyond the nation, stressed by the narrow linguistic approach, the translation involves the transfer of meaning contained in one set of language sign into another set of language signs through complete use of dictionary and grammar. The process involves a whole set of extra linguistic criteria. Edward Speer claims that language is a guide to a social reality, and the human beings are at the mercy of the language that has become the seldom the medium of expression for their society. Experience, as I discussed with you, with these two words, we begin our lecture with these two words, anubhav and anubhuti. Experience, anubhav, he asserts, is largely determined by the language habits of the community, and each separate structure represents a separate reality. No two languages are even sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The world in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. On linguistics aspects of translation, Roman Jacobson discuss the types of translation. And in his research paper, he writes that interlingual translation or rewarding an interpretation of verbal sign by means of other signs in the same language. Further, he says that interlingual translation or translation proper and intersemiotic translation means transmulation, example, music or image. There is a potential confusion between these two words, translation with interpreting. So when we use the mobile app to understand the foreign language, what exactly that application is doing? It is translating or interpreting. Interpreting means oral translation of a spoken message or text. The potential field are issues covered by translation are vast and complex. Swagatam could be the translation of welcome, or it could be the translation, it could be the interpretation of welcome. But how we will translate the word hi? Translation also exists between different varieties of the same language, and into that might be considered less convenient languages such as sign languages and more codes. When we study communication skills, we talk about non-verbal clues, and those non-verbal clues are also treated as a translation, but ultimately it is a interpretation, translation and interpretation of non-verbal signs. But when we translate something which is written, which is in black and white, we require the specific study of it. For example, there are such words in the same language. There are two words used in, for example, lift, elevator, lorry, truck, tin, can, tele, television, tube, subway. In case of hello, hi, you are supposed to translate it into Hindi or Gujarati. As a translator, we must go with the word namaste or namaskar or namaskaram. So, the translation studies gives us various definitions of translation. As we know that translation is a process, it is a product. The first definition says that translation is the process of transfiguring written text from source language to target language, conducted by translator or translators in a specific socio-cultural context. Translation is the written product or it is translated text which results from that process that which functions in the socio-cultural context of the target language. The cognitive, linguistic, visual, cultural, and ideological phenomena which are an integral part of first and the second definition of translation. Suppose you have a clear idea in your mind about something and you speak it out to me in your mother tongue, and I am not able to understand your mother tongue, that message will not decoded by me. So the translator therefore operate as a decoder of the text, which open up the meaning of the written words. So translation is nothing but it is a process of decoding and recording the task place. So the translation of idioms, translation of poems, translation of dialects have their own challenges, and for that we require enough and good training, good experience, anubhav of translating the words, sentences, and over that we must have the good understanding of the meaning of those words. And ultimately, the aim of translation is universality. That once it is translated, it must be accepted, it must be celebrated by its reader. But sometime a translator face a problem of untranslatability. That's, there are some words, there are some structure which are difficult to be translated. When such difficulties are encountered by the translator, the whole issue of translability of the text is raised. And those problems are solely depend upon the linguistic and cultural basis. On linguistic level, it is find it is difficult to find the proper and appropriate lexical or syntactical word, suitable word in target language for the source language item. So the purpose of translation theory then is to reach an understanding of the process undertaken in the act of translation, and not, as is so commonly misunderstood, to provide a set of norms for effecting the perfect translation. In the same way, literary criticism does not seek to provide a set of instruction for producing the ultimate poem or novel, but rather to understand the internal and external structures operating within the around a work of art. So, as a translator, when we study translation studies, we need to keep certain things in our mind, that every text is unique, and at the same time it is the translation of another text. No text is entirely original because language itself, in its essence, is already a translation. Firstly, of the non-verbal word, and secondly, since ever sign and every phrase is the translation of another sign and another phrase. However, this argument can be treated around without losing any of its validity. All texts are original because every translation is distinctive. Every translation up to a certain point is an invention, and as such, it constitutes a unique text. I thank you all. Namaste.